many publishing representatives in the past several months. Now it's time to hear from the other side, the writers, without whom there would be no publishing. We have three distinguished, successful Washington-based writers with us today, representing all shades of writing. Barbara Raskin, novelist and English professor. Richard Rashke, nonfiction writer in the middle. And John Dingus, magazine and newspaper writer, the far side. Richard has written two novels, The Killing of Karen Silkwood, and most recently, Escape from Sobibor. Escape from Sobibor is a book about the escape of 600 Jews from a Nazi death camp in Poland in 1943. Barbara Raskin has written Loose Ends, The National Anthem, and Out of Order. John Dingus is co-author of Assassination on Embassy Road, a book that detailed the killing of Orlando Letelier. The book is now under option to United Artists, and hope it will be made into a movie. He's also contributed frequently to the Washington Post, the New York Times Magazine, and other periodicals on the subject of Latin America and South America. Barbara Raskin is also chairperson of the National Executive Board of the National Writers Union, which we hope will do for fiction, nonfiction, and magazine writers what Ronald Reagan's Screenwriters Guild did for screenwriters 40 years ago. John Dingus is a member of the National Executive Board of the National Writers Union and chairman of the Washington chapter. Each writer will talk for about 20 minutes, and then after a break, engage in the kind of free-for-all discussion that writers are known for. Please welcome our guests.
Thank you. I guess I go first. I must confess we were all very flattered that the authors were included in this series of seminars you have here. And luckily, I was actually, when we divided up the turf among the three of us, I made a grab for the socioeconomic conditions of writers. That seemed A, the easiest, B, the thing that might take the least amount of research, and C, then I would get to talk about myself maybe. But anyway, to give you a 20-minute breakdown of the socioeconomic conditions of writers is obviously going to be an oversimplification. If this were, 100 years ago, I could talk to you about chilly garrets and cheap red wine and totally free love and things like that. But now things have changed enormously, and writers find themselves caught in a economic situation which really boggles the mind of people who by choice didn't go into business or anything else. They wanted to be writers, and now we've been caught in this marketplace economy where commercial considerations sort of dominate the scene, and one has to, out of self-defense, try to become versatile about these sorts of things, exactly what I never wanted to pay attention to, but I've been forced to. So now, talk in, outdoor cafes, of which there's a few in Washington, or bars, smoky bars, are about conglomerate takeovers of various publishing houses and high technology and whether or not you're going to get a home computer and how you could pay for it if you did, but then you could deliver your manuscript on a disc and get it in faster and maybe get a better percentage of the royalties, and all sorts of other commercial considerations, indeed starting with the original idea for a novel, which unconsciously, and it's irreversible. Will it sell? Will somebody want to bother with this book? Is it the kind of thing that can go? And these have been forced upon us, fiction and nonfiction writers alike. And it's certainly changed both the kinds of books that are written and the ways in which they're published and promoted. Let's see, there's all kinds of new figures about the economy of writing in the country today. Columbia University, in their journalism review last year, did a survey based on 1979 figures, which established that the average American writer earns less than $5,000 a year from his or her writing, exactly $4,775 a year. I've been writing for about 35 years, and that certainly sounds totally accurate in terms of my income. in all those years in which I, most of the time, for 15 of those years, taught full-time on English department staffs at GW, Catholic, Georgetown, and American universities, I never made more than $20,000 in any one given year. And I worked hard. I published 3 novels during those years, innumerable nonfiction journalism pieces, picked up every kind of consulting job I could while raising 3 children who finally got raised. And I haven't, you know, I still haven't made any money. And let's see, when I was 12, I sold my first short story to 17 magazine, and I got $50 for it. And last week, I sold another article, a little bit longer, and got $50 for it. So, you know, I have no illusions at all. And the people around the country who keep writing are, you know they're going to be penurious, except for maybe 50 to 100 American authors a year who score in a big way and get to be one of those blockbusting authors and make themselves a nice mint of money. And for the rest of us, we struggle in not the romantic ways of earlier times, but just in this sort of gross economical, commercial system that we live in. Okay, along the way, while I was, struggling in a variety of ways, I finally decided, having sort of an activist spirit in me, that I would begin to try to do something for writers. Many who were worse off than myself, since I was married and had some, backfall position in terms of my husband's salary, that we needed some sort of organization to protect us a little bit in terms of health insurance, which individual writers can't usually buy on their own, or which is exorbitantly expensive, and a variety of other things. And so I, with the backing of a well-to-do Washington philanthropist, and another person, started the Washington Independent Writers, which you may have heard about, which has 1,400 members and really does have the membership of just about every writer in the Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. area. And this organization, you pay $50 for a membership. It's open membership. If you believe you're a writer and you're crazy enough to think you are, you can belong to it. And we offer all kinds of services. There's a telephone-in job bank. I mean, I have used it, where you call up and some commercial newsletter needs somebody to edit and put out a company newsletter real fast. You can get those kind of jobs over the telephone. It offers Blue Cross Blue Shield and the GW health plan. It offers a number of evening seminars and issues that are of interest to area writers. Lots of services, and also a lot of social activities, because writing is a very isolating job. People are alone at home most of the time. And this offered an opportunity for exchanging information and having some kind of relationship with other people involved in the same crazy profession. So that's been, that organization started in '75, so it's 8 years old, and is doing very well. But in the meantime, I realized that although I was president and been on the board for 6 years, this organization was not helping me where I needed help most, which was economically. And last October, a year ago October, the Nation Institute in New York held the first American Writers Congress, which was just a marvelous event. There were 3,000 American writers came there to the Roosevelt Hotel in New York. It's a big old hotel. And in the 3 days of that conference, sold more alcohol in the bar than they had in the 98 years they'd been in business there. And so it was really a fun weekend, and a lot of things got done. And people, Vonnegut was there, and big name people were there, and everybody was angry, and they were angry at the publishing industry. And there were seminars and all kinds of things, and the last plenary session, where does that come first? Well, the final session, where there really were probably 2,500 people in the auditorium at the hotel, rose to their feet and in unanimous roar of approval asked for the formation of a national writers union. And names I know you're all conversant with, endorsed it, and it began to happen. Now, of course, the people who are putting it together are not the very fancy, well-to-do, very well-known writers who have endorsed it, but sort of people with more time on their hands, maybe. And I filled a power vacuum at the top and became the national chair of that. And have since spent the last year and a half most of my time trying to organize this thing, and have received a great deal of support from labor union organizations in the country. And Lane Kirkland has endorsed us in a letter and we have gotten some financial support from other unions. The organizing of professionals, as you would know, is not so unfamiliar anymore, and is becoming more and more common as the economy worsens and people are hurting more financially. So this is interesting. Well, we now have about 1,400 members, but we've never had a national recruiting drive yet, and we've never even contacted the original 3,000 people who were at the Congress, mostly because we don't have the stamps. But now we found someone who's going to print it for us and mail it out. So we're going to do that. And there's no reason why this can't happen. We very much are modeling ourselves after the Screenwriters Guild. They are tremendously successful. And we have certain bureaucratic problems in terms of the NLRB and whether or not a freelance writer can be an employee. Although we're sort of going to argue if you've got a 2 or 3 year contract with Simon & Schuster or Random House, in a sense you are in their employ. However, that of course brings up the copyright work for hire thing, and so it's complicated and we're having problems. Oh, but before I go on, I do want to say the one thing, so we have all these worries, financial, let alone literary or cultural worries, and the only thing we don't worry about are copyrights, really, and I want to thank you for that. I mean, that sort of happens automatically. It's one of those things up there, and we are occasionally warned that after 26 years, 27, we have to renew. Oh, not anymore. Good. Oh, right. Okay, so I don't even have to worry about that. Well, that's good. So, except we are all involved, WIW and the National Writers Union and the Authors Guild and all the other writing organizations in a lobbying effort to revise the work for hire clause of the copyright law, which really jeopardizes freelance writers incredibly. And we've sort of just begun educating ourselves about it, and as you know, Senator Mathias had her hearings last October, and now it's possible Bob Kastenmeier on the House side will hold hearings in the near future, because it really was very hard for us to hang on to copyrights hang on to our property rights in a piece when we had to sell it for financial reasons. And as the New York Times Magazine was wont to do, stamped on the back of your check, this gives us all rights in perpetuity or something, and when you endorsed the check, you had simultaneously endorsed away your rights. So now we do have to get engaged in that. And, well, there are, political and legislative things. You saw Styron and Vonnegut were here about donation of manuscripts to university libraries and things like that, and tax deduction. So there's those business elements. But that isn't even what I wanted to talk about. Let's see. Okay, well, I was supposed to talk about the socioeconomic conditions. I sort of covered economic ones. And then about the struggling writer, the modestly successful writer, and the big killer writer who makes millions. And, well, to sort of back into that, the few multi-million-dollar deals that are solidified each year have been very hard for modestly successful and struggling writers, because first of all it captures the attention both of the publishing industry and the media and book buyers. There's a book that somebody paid $3 million to acquire, and paperback sales were 4.5, and the movie options were 6.9, and Ally McGraw is going to star, and it gets all messed up in that stuff. And then a serious young writer, maybe of a first novel, is confronted with a tilted universe in which to begin to operate. First of all, it's very hard to sell anything to publishers these days. They're not doing well. And I suppose you get this, but the Authors Guild Bulletin is probably the best presented information pack about the authors' problems in the country today. Unfortunately, our union isn't geared up to produce anything like this yet, but I hope you people sort of are, conversant with it, because it does give you the author's position on these things. So say there's a young, as a matter of fact, in the last Authors Guild Bulletin, they took a theoretical case, well, it wasn't theoretical, there was a young woman novelist from the South who sold her first novel. And then they went into the economics of publishing that book. Royalties have decreased enormously. Advances have decreased enormously. Royalties are severely curtailed because publishers are producing smaller print runs of books, and sales are not going well anyway. The publishing industry is not as big and powerful as people like us may think, and is somewhere around the 47th corporate income producer in the United States. The whole industry and every related element of it. So it's not that big, and they're having bad times. So a young novelist who has a good first novel might be able to acquire an agent, who are becoming more and more commercially minded, and the agent might be able to send it around and finally find a buyer who may offer $3,000, maybe as much as $5,000, for 2 or 3 years' work. We're talking about almost no income. I mean, this is volunteer service that writers give. And you get half the advance up front. So if you sell for $5,000, you get $2,500 upon sale and $2,500 upon publication, which even after you've submitted your manuscript has got to take 9 solid months before it comes into print. So you spread that over 3 years, take off 10% for the agent, then some income tax, then your expenses, a little child care. Well, I mean, it shouldn't even be a consideration, in fact. One should write what they feel they ought to write without considering those factors. So then the editor who is brave enough to say, let's publish this book, which will, given this kind of a first novel, not produce any profit for the publisher. A 5,000 print run will not produce profit because, first of all, they have to make up the $5,000 advance, and they're not going to make too much more than that. Hardback novels are now selling for something like $12.95 is an average price for hardback. People are hard-pressed to pay that for a novel. They can't afford, it's not cost-effective to run off less than 5,000 copies, but they just don't break even, and certainly the author realizes no money. Royalties start after the advance is paid back in a 10, 12.5, 15% of a very small profit margin, and it's just almost unfeasible. The companies are living off the few blockbusters that they can find and develop and promote. The small book is not given any ad budget. A New York Times book review magazine page ad costs $8,000. Very often, advertising and promotion budgets are something like $2,500 for a first novelist. The writer is never informed how many copies will be printed. Ann Beatty, who's maybe our most successful short story writer, published with, I think, Random House, her last book, and they would not either write into her contract or tell her informally how many books they were going to print. This is determined by the economic conditions a year or two later when the book finally comes out. Only the very big names, Erdman and just the very top income producers, Herman Wouk and people like that, can dictate any of the terms. The contracts were modestly middle of the line successful writers sign are really documents of exploitation. We have no editorial control. Whatever young lady from Sarah Lawrence is now working on the editorial staff of Simon & Schuster, sort of does what she thinks is best for your book. We have no control over the cover, what the book looks like, its size, or the cost, because $12.95 pretty much places out of the market the very audience we're trying to reach. We have no control over how it's promoted, how it's distributed, if at all. And we're given very poor royalty receipts, royalty statements. They come 6 months after the fact. They fudge on everything. I mean, imagine if you were a corporation trying to account for some 5,000 books strewn around the country in various, one in a bookstore copy, and they come back often open boxes that are eventually pulped, and I mean the whole thing. And they inform you a few days ahead of time that if you can come up with a certain amount of money, they'll, instead of burning your books, well, I guess they don't burn, they pulp them, that you can have them. And all this time you've been earning zero money, right? You can't even afford to buy your book back, and you know they're being trashed in New Jersey. So it's really rough. And we don't really resent the big winners, but there's just so few of them. They are squeezing out the other people. And not only is the industry hurting, but the cultural scene in America is being deprived. And we're losing some young quality people that should be published and should be allowed to begin their careers and not confronted with this kind of economic miasma in which we're all drowning. So on that happy note, I'll turn it over to the next person.
I belong to the 99 percentile of writers. I make a living out of writing. And the word making a living is meaningless. Depends on your lifestyle. For me, living means paying all my professional writing expenses plus making a minimum of $20,000 a year. So I belong to that percentile. I have belonged to that percentile for the last 3 years. I belong to it this year. I know I have no idea about next year. One failure, and I could be dead. One failure could just wipe out my savings. And the only way that I can survive as a writer, a full-time writer, is to have at least 1 year's savings in the bank, which I've trained myself to think about not as savings, but as my living expenses for the current year. It's the only way I can do it. I'm going to be talking about the author and the publishing process, and I think I'll do that through speaking about the 2 books I published and the one that I'm writing now, because that way it'll be more specific. And since I write only nonfiction, I can't afford to write fiction, then I want you to keep that in mind. Everything I say translate into nonfiction. Don't translate that into novels, because I may be leading you in the wrong direction. How does one get a nonfiction book published? Well, while I was freelancing and working half-time for a newspaper in order to afford the luxury of breaking into the book business, I started to write proposals. That's the only way to get a book published, a nonfiction book, is to write a proposal. Unless you're a Jimmy Carter just out of office, you don't have to. Unless you're a Cy Hirsch, who's going to write a book on Kissinger, you have to get out there and write a proposal. You have to say, this is who I am, this is what I'm going to write, this is what the book is going to say, and it becomes a quasi-legal document that the publisher can use against you when you turn in the manuscript in case you produce something that doesn't match up to what you said you were going to produce. So you write a proposal. For me, writing a proposal means a minimum of 1 month unpaid research. Sometimes that involves other expenses, a lot of phone calls, some travel, a lot of Xerox, and that kind of thing. It took me 4 proposals before I scored my first book, which was The Killing of Karen Silkwood. I wrote a proposal on a potential book about H.L. Hunt. It was a 1.5 years early, because 1.5 years after I submitted the proposal and no one would take it, that whole silver business with the Hunt family broke. And publishers were going crazy looking for authors for books, but I was already on Silkwood, so I couldn't get into that. Then I wrote a proposal on a book about the life and times of Gary Gilmore. And I had connections with his family back in Salt Lake City area. And I got feedback from several houses that the material was, I wrote 4 chapters and an outline, went all the way out there, spent about $700 doing it, and I was told, stimulating material, really good, but who's interested in yesterday's news? Executioner's Song, Norman Mailer, Pulitzer, multi-million-dollar project. Because he wrote it, not, if I could have written the same thing and better. So So it was a real lesson that it's not, you know, what your topic is or how good you are, it's who you are. So then I finally wrote a proposal on the killing of Karen Silkwood, and I was not going to, I first wrote it as a pamphlet to pay for the research. I wasn't going to do the book because a friend of mine, Howard Cohn, already had a contract to write a book on Karen Silkwood, and he sat on it, and he sat on it, and he was going nowhere with it, and I wasn't sure he was ever going to do it, so I decided to submit mine. That was 1978. Nobody was interested. All of 78, it went in and out of all these houses. Who's interested in Karen Silkwood? 1979 rolls around. In comes the China Syndrome. In comes 3 Mile Island. And then the phone started to ring. Within a week, I had 3 publishers interested. And by the time the book would come out, all of that, I mean, the perfect time for that book to come out would have been just when 3 Mile Island hit, just when the China Syndrome came out. But publishers are notoriously backward. They can't read or sense trends frequently. They wait for something to happen, then they react to it, and it's too late. So anyway, the first publisher was McGraw-Hill. They said, "We love it. We'll give you $20,000 for it." I said, "Okay." The next day they called back and said their legal department vetoed it because they were frightened of lawsuits by Kerr McGee, the nuclear corporation that Karen Silkwood worked for. In fact, the editor told me the lawyers were just, you know, kind of squirming in their chairs when they went over the proposal, and they said if it were anyone else but Kerr McGee, we would do this book. Of course, McGraw-Hill publishes Business Week and those kinds of things. But then another publisher was very interested until he heard that Howard Cohn was also doing a book on the topic and said, if we can't be first, we don't want it. And Houghton Mifflin said, we don't care if we're second. So they took the book, and it just so happens that I beat Howard Cohn by 6 months, and I never thought I would do that and kind of pull the rug from under his feet. My second proposal on Escape from Sobibor took me a month to write, basically here in the Library of Congress, and some phone calls, and I sold it within 24 hours. I express mailed it to my editor, who got it the next day, called me that day and said, would you take $25,000 for it? And we managed to jack it up a little bit. Because they just said, this is going to be a good book, and we don't want them to go somewhere else, so we grabbed it. But again, it was a risk. 1 month of work, and there's no way that I would ever get paid for that if the thing fell through. Well, my next book, I called up my editor and said, I've got this topic I want to work on. She said, fine, we're interested. I spent a month. I sent it to her, and she said no. The topic was Greensboro, the case of the Nazis and the Klan and the Communist Workers' Party. And she rejected it after a month's work by saying, there are no heroes and there are no heroines in this story, and therefore nobody will buy it. She's probably right. It was a mistake on my part. Then I got involved in another project, and I needed the cooperation of someone who strung me along for a month, and the last minute said no. So I lost another month down the drain. Then I started on another topic, and my editor was interested, and I developed it to a point, and she said, no, we're not interested. So finally, I took another project that was down on my list. It was not the one that I really wanted to write, and I do have a contract. It is a biography of Bill Lear, designer, inventor, bon vivant, and professional lecher. And the book has great potential. I feel, and I do consider myself an artist. And writing is my medium, and nonfiction writing is a further development of that medium. My book reviewers do not consider me an artist. Perhaps my readers don't consider me an artist. That's all beside the point. It's I feel and I know I am an artist, and I write like an artist. Therefore, I compare myself in a much, much lesser way to the great painters and the great sculptors of time who could never or frequently could not afford to do the sculpting and the painting they wanted because they had to consider the marketplace. Therefore, they took commissions to do the portrait of so-and-so who could afford to pay them, and the sculpture of the bust of Balzac, and portrait of George Washington. And they needed the money. But they managed within those limitations to turn out pieces of art. And so I find myself as a writer-artist who must make a living in this category, and I fully intend to write my biography of Bill Lear in a very artistic way, even though the subject matter is not my first choice. The author, another point I want to touch on is the author, publisher, and editor relationship. There is no love-hate relationship between authors, publishers, and editors. There's a hate relationship. You will find very few authors who have much good to say about their publishers and their editors. Look at each one separately. It is very difficult to sustain your anger against a publisher because you know that book publishing companies are not greedy. Like authors, they barely make a living. I mean, they may get 8 or 10% return on their investment, and that's it. They are not wealthy. Therefore, they're not like some magazines and newspapers are extremely wealthy. They could pay more, they could do more for you. Publishers frequently can't. You get angry at them is because when it comes time to make their cuts and tighten their belt, they do it by putting the noose around your neck and pulling it. You are the most expendable, they think, a person who works for them because there's so many out there. They don't give a hoot. There's always a dozen waiting to take your place if you fall by the way. There will always be 40,000 writers to publish the 40,000 books that the publishers want to publish, or 38,000 or 42 if they wish. So they go after you because you're helpless, hence the need for a union. They'll cut your advances. They'll chisel you on your royalties. They will try to delay their payments. They make you pay for the indexing of your own book. They make you pay for all the pictures that you have in your book, and when you want those pictures back, they won't give them to you. They make a print and charge you. And you can't do a thing about it. They get you in small ways and large ways at every turn. They don't demand salary cuts from their full-time staff people. They don't cut the staff. They don't even cut the number of books they're publishing, because then they'll have people on the staff with nothing to do. They go after the authors. So authors don't like publishers. And frequently we're willing to jump from one to the other if it's expedient to do so, even though we don't want to. I love my publisher, Houghton Mifflin. It is one of the still independently owned publishing companies. It's old, it's staid, it's conservative. I don't particularly like that. It does quality work in general. I like that. But I'll dump them if I have to in order for a better deal somewhere else. Editors, you can be angry at, and most of us are angry, because I can define an editor in one sentence. An editor is someone who works for a publisher who can't read, can't think, and can't write. Editors have become acquisition people and expediters. They're like single or recently divorced men who go to a singles bar and they cruise looking for meat. They want to add people to their stable. They want to bring writers aboard, and they cruise looking for them. Once they get them, all they do is expedite. They tighten the screws to get the manuscript. They barely read it, pass it on to a copy editor. Frequently, copy editors are very good, but they're all subcontracted out of the house. They're freelance individuals. They get your book into the production line. They beat the sales department. First of all, they get the project through the editorial board. They fight for a larger press run if they believe in your book. They sit on the publicity department. They do all of these mechanical things and do everything but, and we want those things done, but what you want. And that is substantive editing, looking at your book as a whole. I hire an editor to look at my book substantively because the house won't do it. So we have that problem that we have to each work out in his or her own way. Finally, promoting and marketing the book. By the way, my editor did very little on the killing of Karen Silkwood. On my other book, my new book, Escape from Sobibor, she barely recommended a change anywhere except to throw out a whole chapter, and which was a mistake, but I gave in because I did want to fight and I want to get the darn thing out. And on my current project, she keeps telling me she has a market in mind for my book on Bill Lear, which is not my market. It's a very narrow one. And so she keeps saying, don't put too much in there about the sex life of Bill Lear, which is just the opposite of what any other editor or publisher would say. In terms of promoting and marketing the book, people who are in nonfiction writing have to promote. I have found only 2 or 3 people who love it. Most of us hate it. It is a terrible, miserable experience. Going from television station to television station, radio station to radio station in particular. Getting interviewers who have never read your book, who may not have even seen it. I got an interview in Pittsburgh by someone who never even saw my book. All he knew it was something about the Second World War. We spent the first 15 minutes, I tried to channel him into the right direction. They don't read your book. They generally don't care about it. They insult you in that way and other professional ways. And the same old dreary questions over and over and over again until you get sick and tired of listening to yourself. And yet you're selling. You've got to, really get into it and say, this is, it's like the first audience, the first time. You have to be stimulating. Television, it's like someone asking you to say all you know about abortion in 60 seconds. That's the kind of questions they throw at you. And usually it's the last question. It's a miserable experience. It's draining. You do not get paid for it. And the publishers don't care. They throw everything at you. After all, it's your time. They'll give you a podunk radio station that beams about 6 miles, and there are no books out there in that desert for 350 miles, but they'll line it up because they'll say, well, who knows, he may be able to sell 2 or 3 books for us. So at some point you put your foot down and you have to start screening your own stuff and saying, no, I won't do that. No, I won't do that. Here's my cutoff point on this. I just can't do it anymore. It's a very tough and a very draining thing, and most of us don't like it. And you have to do it, and everybody depends on it. How are people going to know that your book is out there? Publishers aren't going to put a lot of advertising money behind you unless they smell blockbuster. So you depend on the reviewers, and you depend on this symbiotic relationship with the media where they get free entertainment, and let's face it, it's entertainment, it's not public service. They want you to entertain that audience through telling them about your book. It's nonfiction, it's informational, but it's got to entertain. It'll cut you off. You'll never come back again. Stimulate, entertain, tell nice stories, hook them. And they will, it's a symbiotic relationship because they need to fill the airtime, and you need the exposure, and it works beautifully. On Karen Silkwood, I had over 70 radio and television interviews in a very short period of time. And on my current book, Sobibor, less. But they were both very draining, one because the subject matter is emotional, exterminating people, and the other one because I was walking that tightrope line on potential libel. Every time I open my mouth on Silkwood, I got to think, who is possibly going to sue me on this statement? So I developed some pat phrases that I could use and defend, and I threw them out wherever I went, saying, for example, that Kerr McGee was a nuclear pig pen. I coined that one somewhere, and then I would explain what that was, and I felt safe on it. But it's for those reasons, unless you're doing something very entertaining in and of itself, it's very draining. Very briefly, 2 other topics. One of the things that bother you as a writer is the fact that you are liable for what you write as a nonfiction writer. And no matter how good you are, you can get yourself into hot water. Standard contracts generally make you 50% liable, even for the damages done to the publisher. 50%. 50% of their legal fees. 50% of the award, plus paying your own. because you both sued at the same time. Now the publishers, it's one beautiful thing they're doing for authors, is they are gradually introducing libel insurance. They're putting authors under their own libel insurance plans, which basically, unless the publisher can show that you were wantonly negligent, didn't do your job, you get off scot-free. That's, let's give a little applause to the publishers on that one. The other thing are corporate takeovers. My company is still independent. Most are owned by corporations, and this is a two-edged sword. Corporations have a lot of money that they can pour into a loser, which means that a publishing company that isn't making a lot of money can keep going for a longer period of time, thus giving authors a chance to publish. The other edge, and whereas the independent companies like Houghton Mifflin have no corporate finances to back them up other than what they make on their books. The other edge of the sword is that corporations are very profit-oriented, and they want a high return, and they can get impatient with companies that don't give them the kind of return. And they can insist on deals and blockbusters and everything else that they know nothing about. And as a result of that, when a company isn't doing well, they just sell it to someone else and keep selling it back and forth. And thus a company can lose its total identity. Authors don't know if they're coming or going anymore, and that's generally what happens. One last thing that goes along with this is that books, as you know, do not make it to bookstores generally right from the publisher. They go through distributors and large chains like Walden Books and Dalton, J.B. Dalton, whatever it is. Simple fact is, if you can't get these 2 or 3 of the big chains behind your book, you're dead. I don't care how good your book is, you are dead. If they won't pick it up and promote it, there's no way your book is going to get to the bookstores. If it doesn't get to the bookstores, people can't find it, and they have a limit to their patience as well. So you are dependent on those chains. And if your publisher doesn't know how to massage them, milk them, stroke them, kick them, whatever, you're out. There's not a thing you can do. Again, back to what Barbara said, it's the helplessness about creating a work of art, and then it's totally and completely out of your hands except promoting. I guess that's it. That took longer than 20 minutes.
Do you want me to go ahead, or do you want to have a break now?
Why don't we have the break now? 10 minutes?
I'll have a chance
break.
to put.
Right.
This is Jim Collins. He's our secretary.
Very enlightening.
When I was a police reporter, it's hard to consider yourself
I know.
to write. But I guess sometime in the middle of the book, I decided that I was.
Before I went into books, and except on an occasional magazine piece, I didn't consider myself an artist. But when I started to get into books and I saw looking at the broad picture and working towards certain kinds of eliciting certain kinds of responses,
Yeah, that works. Okay, I'm gonna take quite a bit of a different approach, but I want to, because I'm doing that, I want to preface by saying that the stories that Barbara and Richard have told are right in line with my own experiences, all the way. And so instead of telling my own horror stories, I think you had a good taste of what it's like to be out there. And I want to touch on some specific issues that affect writers from the outside, and perhaps give you some information on a little bit more technical level about some of the factors that we live with. Kind of in general, I'm going to talk about the author's work environment. And basically, I'm talking about the government and the law, and then I'll get into a second general topic, which is changing technology. Authors are notoriously poor lobbyists. We've done a very poor job, unlike the oil companies, in shaping the way our society treats us. And that's really the reason among the reasons that you've had the stories that Richard and Barbara told you about. Strangely enough, authors in other countries are not treated the way we are. The environment in which they work is much more secure. There's much more support in the society for what they do, for the writing profession. We think that this is changing, that writers are reaching that critical point of anger, of dissatisfaction, of realization that there's something that is harmful not only to themselves and their profession, but also to the culture as a whole, that if it's not remedied, will be damaging to the country and to the environment as a whole. And so writers are starting to stick together, and that's what's behind the writers' organizations that have gotten going, in particular the National Writers Union. The most obvious thing you can see, if you look at the way government, the United States government, treats writers, is first of all, there's no explicit treatment at all. There's very little about the the body of federal laws and programs that treat writers at all. It's in a negative way. There is a lack of support for something that is generally considered in most cultures an essential part. The Library of Congress, of course, is the major writers program supported by the U.S. government. That is it. The last major writers subsidy program was the WPA that ended in 1941, in which for the first and only time in this country there were actual subsidies for the writer's endeavor. This is not a lament, this is just a fact of life. We would like to change it, and just as the oil companies were successful at it with their clout, the way it operates in this country is that you join together and do it. The fact that we don't have the umpteen billions of dollars probably does not bode well for gaining writers' depletion allowances that will allow us to have the U.S. taxpayer pay not only for what we write, but for what we don't write. So we're not looking to that, but we definitely, many writers would like a more positive treatment of writers in the government and in the laws. What is happening, what do I have in mind? Elsewhere, in 10 countries in the world, and I may be corrected on this, but there's 10 that I know of at this point, there is a general government subsidy of writers, of published writers, through what is called the public lending right. England is the most recent example of this. The other countries include Sweden, West Germany, and Denmark. Belgium also has it. Most of the European countries have it. It basically means that if you have a book that is in the public libraries, the rationale is that this is a writer's subsidy. The way it works now, that this is a writer's giving his labor to something that is then lent freely. The system of the public libraries is financed by the state, but there is no income generated for the producer of the basic unit of a library, namely the book. The public lending right is based on the principle that there should be a return to the authors as well as to the benefit that accrues to the people of the country through a public library system. And it's a very simple program. The government in England, for example, appropriates, in this case, $4 million. This $4 million is divided among authors who register their books, and is divided among them according to the use, the lending of their books, the rate of lending of their books, with a maximum payment of $10,000 and a minimum payment of $10. The other countries have a slightly different system, but basically what you're talking about in the bottom line is simply government has appropriated a certain sum of money to go to authors. And the question is, how do you distribute it? You distribute it based on how their books are taken out of public libraries. The second way in which the government could be supportive of writers is through protection of our right to organize. We are in a very difficult position vis-a-vis the labor laws in this country because although the courts have never defined this, we tend to be seen as independent contractors. In other words, as businessmen. We are seen as little Mobil Oils. We have to follow the same antitrust. I mean, there's a tendency. We haven't, thank God, it has not been determined yet. But there is a tendency to see us as coming under the same antitrust laws as the big corporations. Which, if this was ever brought onto us, if this was ever specifically applied to us in the writers' union, it would mean that a group of writers cannot get together and determine the kind of conditions under which they negotiate with a publisher. In other words, we would lose that minimum of control that we are attempting to gain over our relationships with our publishers. And so obviously one of the things that the emerging writers lobby will be seeking is an exemption or a redefinition to clarify that writers qualify under the National Labor Relations Act as employees and are not considered to be independent contractors. Barbara touched briefly on the issue of work for hire. I wonder if I could just put a little more detail behind it because I think she was speaking in a general way. The work for hire clause of the copyright law, and I'm no expert on this, and I've had to educate myself because it had never affected me until I started studying it. Basically, the copyright law was of great benefit to writers because it gave us automatic rights that we used to have to stipulate. The problem was that one of the rights we had, one of the rights that we gained was that we were presumed to have all of the copyright provisions that were not otherwise negotiated away. Whereas before it was cloudy in that area. However, there was one clause in the copyright law that said that the copyright would go to the publisher, not to the author, in cases of works done for hire. The purpose of this clause was to allow for the kinds of joint authorship, not co-authorship, such as the book that I wrote with my co-author, but the kinds of works that are put together in a committee. It might be a group of people as big as the group in this room, where many people would put certain things into. It would be all put together by a general editor. We're talking about things like some kinds of wildlife magazine, for instance, which is basically text surrounding pictures, all of which comes from very different sources. It's all kind of jumbled together. In other words, there's no one author. That was the intention, as I understand it, of this exemption in the copyright law. However, the law was written to allow the work for hire provision to be stipulated in a contract with an author. That is the provision that is killing us. Because it allows, I go to a publisher, I don't know if this is happening in very many books, but let's talk about it in a magazine or a newspaper. You do an article for a magazine, you write every word of it, it goes out under your byline. It is totally an artistic work of your own. But there's a clause in the contract that says it shall be understood that this was work done for hire. If you don't sign it, you don't get paid. In other words, obviously we would not want to sign that, but the condition is placed that if you don't sign it, you won't get the assignment. And there are many, many magazines that are beginning to use this provision. It totally strips you of your copyright. It's not just the same thing as deeding your copyright, selling your copyright for a certain number of years. It totally removes the copyright from you so that at any time in the future you want to even reprint your own article, you have to ask permission of the publisher and pay him. So that's the current bugaboo, the work for hire law. In taxation, it's a mixed bag. There are some tax laws that are more or less to our advantage, or there are certain ways that we can do our taxes to our advantage. For example, writers commonly write off, they use Schedule C, which is a small business form. They write off the space in their house, for example, that they use as an office, if they use it as an office. That's very beneficial. It means that you can basically write off most of your working expenses against your gross income. So that's, to a certain extent, helpful. However, the other tax laws that affect publishers have their most detrimental effect against authors. For example, the tax provision that in effect forces publishers to either pulp books, shred them after a certain number of years, or pay taxes on their stocks. The result, this is, to the publisher, not such a bad deal. But to the author, it means that your book goes out of print within a very few years after it's been published. It encourages the practice of remaindering, which is this quick sale of no profit to the author of a book that is maybe a year old, maybe 6 months old. A book that is still of current interest, a book for which perhaps reviews are still coming out, is being dumped on the market at $2 or $3 a copy, at which we make several pennies. It undercuts our whole royalty base. So, in other words, the tax provisions that apply to businesses in general, when applied to publishers, work to the detriment of authors. Another provision that has hurt us is if the Reagan administration's new tax changes go into effect, increasing self-employment tax, that's a direct hit at authors, because all authors pay self-employment tax. It's been estimated at a direct 3% across the board tax. I think I could be corrected on that because I'm not a tax accountant, but that's a pretty big bite. It's not progressive. It doesn't hit just the top part of your income. It hits the first penny you make and the last penny you make. A direct 3% increase in our taxes. And we, as you've already found out, are among the low-income groups in this country, not the high-income groups. There are a variety of issues that affect legal issues that affect writers, and I don't want to go into them in very much detail, but just want to mention them. Censorship, libel, Richard talked about that, and I won't go into it. The Freedom of Information Act, the privacy laws, and the issue of reprography, making copies on Xerox machines and circumventing our copyright in that way. There are two cases currently in the courts. One is of censorship that are particularly egregious. One is a book by Jerry Zilk called Behind the Nylon Curtain. It was a book about the DuPont family and the DuPont companies. It was pulled, in effect killed by the publisher because of pressure from the author, because of pressure from the corporation. Jerry won the case at the first court level. I assume that was district court. It's in appeal, and so to a certain extent, this instance of corporate censorship was successfully met. The second case involves Deborah Davis's book about Katharine Graham, the owner of the Washington Post. The book was called Catherine the Great. That book also was pulled out of the bookstores. The rights were returned to the author. In effect, the publisher disowned the book. I think it was 6 weeks after the book came out. Why? The reasons are perhaps unclear, but the fact that the publisher of the Washington Post and some of the high-ranking editors at the Post made very direct threats that they would badmouth the publisher because of this book, probably had something to do with the Harcourt Brace Jovanovich's decision to pull the book. So another case of corporate pressure. Libel laws, the book, or libel suits, the book Missing, which originally came out as The Execution of Charles Horman, and the Costa Gavras book movie Missing was made from it, is now being sued by the former ambassador to Chile and several of the State Department officers who are referred to in the book and referred to in the movie. for libel. Now, merits of the case aside, what you have in all of these cases, I happen to know that case very well, and if you ask me about it, I will vouch for the accuracy of the book. I think it's a tremendous book. The movie is a movie. It's one that perhaps convinces you through the form of a movie rather than through the facts it represents. But in any case, we're not talking about irresponsible journalism here. We're talking about real investigative reporting. The suits brought against these three books, in effect, are the use of libel laws by extremely big power centers in our society against very small power centers, against individuals who are trying to write books. The libel laws, which originally were meant to protect a man's reputation, a woman's reputation, are being used now most often in the publishing industry, most effectively to protect not individuals but corporations and government. And I think that's a disturbing trend. Freedom of Information Act is the basic tool that we use if you're a nonfiction writer. I'm sure that Richard agrees. I don't know, my book could not have been written without a lot of the material obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. It has a double-edged effect. It's not just that you can get the material in these little pieces of paper with all those things crossed out and everything like that. It's that the people that you talk to in the government know that that the information will come out eventually through the Freedom of Information Act, and so they will talk more freely before there's the actual release of the information, as long as we're not talking about classified material and things like that. But general, non-classified government information generally has become more easy to get because of the Freedom of Information Act. And as you all know, this is under severe attack under the current administration, and it's one of the things that will most affect nonfiction writers in preventing us from documenting the workings of government. Technology is something that you don't often associate with writers. Rightly so. Tacitus wrote his book using the same kind of pen as Thomas Hardy did a millennium later. But the technology has changed so much in this century. We've gone from perfecting the typewriter to perfecting the electric typewriter. Between the time I started as a journalist 15 years ago and now, I had to learn to use an electric typewriter, which I thought I would never get used to. And now we're working on word processors. I do a lot of work. I work part-time at the Washington Post, where we work on these enormous systems, things like that. Again, it's a two-edged, it's a double-edged sword. Some of us love the new word processors. I'm among them. I'm a great fan of them. I write better, I think. It gives me much more flexibility. I write faster. I'm somebody that doesn't write clean copy the first time. Revision is very important in my writing. These give us, the word processors give us the technology and the flexibility to, I think, become better writers. I talked to somebody last night at dinner who said that she felt extremely threatened by the new technology. She thought she could never divorce herself from the relationship, the chemistry of writing that develops between you and your typewriter and your desk and your whole work environment. So as we're going through this transition, some people are feeling uncomfortable, other people are feeling more comfortable. But the important aspect is, how does this change, that I want to just mention here, is how does this change the economics of the writing profession? Aside from the psychological effect of working with a television screen rather than a piece of paper, how does it change the economics? Look at these facts. This costs $1. This is what you used to write with for a millennium, 2 millennium, maybe Homer even used one. Typewriter, the best typewriter is about $1,000. A word processor is $2,000 to $5,000 now. It'll go down, probably will approach the level of the good electric typewriters. What does this do to the writer? It means that the entry-level access to writing is restricted. To the extent that publishers begin to demand, to suggest, to cajole that we should turn in clean copy, that we should turn in word processed copy, or even to turn in our work on discs. I don't know of many instances at this point where people actually are demanding the disc, but it'll come. At that point, it means that in order to have access to the market, you have to have the equipment. And the equipment is something that you don't just buy your first day out of college. It's something that requires a capital investment that we've never had to make before. I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, but then I'm somebody that's fairly well established and I've got the money to get one. Or I can go down to my workplace at the Post and I can kind of write my stories at night on their machine and get it off to the publisher. But this is a very important factor to beginning writers, and many beginning writers are a little worried about it. There's another aspect to it. How does it in effect, when you turn in a video disc, let's imagine that case, a disc with an Apple III will give you at least a chapter of a book on one disc that costs $2 or $3. You turn in your book in the form of 15 of these discs rather than in manuscript. What have you done? You have not just changed the medium. You have given a publisher something that the publisher can put into a computer with the appropriate interconnections and compatibility programs that can be directly typeset. You've skipped two processes. You've skipped the editing process and you've skipped the typesetting process, and you also are skipping the proofreading process. What used to be called proofreading, the real technical term of proofreading is proofing the galleys coming out of the typesetter, right? We're not talking about proofing it the way that we do after we get it back from the typesetter. We've skipped, in essence, 3 steps. This makes the publishing process enormously, we've made a savings in the whole production process of books. The question is, who benefits from the savings? Now, you know who's going to benefit from it.
Yeah.
It's not going to be us, and it's not going to be out there in the form of cheaper books, unless we do something about it. Unless readers really are even less powerful than we writers. They have less access, except through the mythical Adam Smith's invisible hand in the marketplace. They have less effect in the publishing industry than we do. Certainly, they can't get books to come out cheaper. It's a big issue. Where is this savings going to be distributed? If we just let it go, don't do anything about it, we're going to have the same advances. We're going to be required to have more expensive equipment to turn in our manuscripts in a form that makes it more difficult, more unlikely to get the kinds of editing that Richard was saying that we really need. And at the same time, you're saving thousands of dollars to the publisher, all of which goes to his profit margin and not to yours. So we're advocating a real close look at this, the way this technology plugs into this editing production process in order to basically increase our income as well as increase the profits of the publisher, which we have nothing against. And also we would like some cheaper books, because then people could read more. Oh, by the way, I read recently, I can't remember where it was, that about the Library of Congress's program of putting books on discs. And obviously the application of this is that I'm turning in something right out of my typewriter that in effect goes to the publisher, but it's on a disc at every point. And at some point it comes right directly into the library as a disc that you can use. And it's never been retyped. It's never been re-keyboarded, which of course is the big hang-up now in putting discs into libraries, right? Because every time you get a book you want to put on a disc, you have to re-keyboard it, or you have to use a scanning process that will do it. So it's the implications are tremendous. I won't say anything more about the union, because I suppose we've mentioned it several times, and there will probably be questions about it. And so that's all I have, and we'll take your questions.
Yes, I have 3, and I'm going to add just 3 short ones. Okay, I want to know, how do you come up with your words that, like the novel you want to write on? Do you just see something that you think that is very interesting somebody say something that strikes your attention and, you write on it?
Well, it comes in lots of different ways. Unfortunately, most of mine came from my own life. It's a mixed bag, where I don't know whether that's good or bad. But something happens and it stays with you. Actually, it occurred to me, a few years ago that over a number of years I kept retelling the same stories to friends, and then suddenly I realized those are the stories that mattered in my life, and those are the ones that I had been writing about, or would, or wanted to. So it's just those few things that really preoccupy you for long times. I think that's what people write about in novels.
I guess the same thing applies to you, right?
Oh, nonfiction, well, I get my ideas from a variety of sources. Sometimes it's something I see in the paper which triggers something. Sometimes a friend suggests something. Sometimes I meet someone who says, hey, I have a good story idea for you, or whatever. But before I select a topic, I have a whole list of criteria that I measure it up against. For example, other than the fact, has anything been done on the topic? I look at it in terms of, will I learn something? Will I grow? Either professionally by a unique challenge to my writing skill, or personally because this is going to reach deep down into me and pull out stuff that I wasn't aware was there and bring it out and make me come to grips with it. I look at it in terms of the marketplace. What potential does this thing have? Currently, I will not write a book that does not have the possibility of someday being made into a movie, because I may be able to skid along making a living on my writing, but unless I can turn it into the entertainment factory, I'll never break out of just making a living, and the pressure will always be on. So my first book, Killing a Karen Silkwood, will be a movie. It's not based on my book, but I was on target. I selected something that was movieable, and the movie's coming out in September, and it should have an impact on my paperback. My second book, I get letters from readers all over the country saying, I can see it now, But so far, although I've had 30 or 40 independent and major producers looking at it, no one bit. Sometimes it takes years, right?
Yep.
Before it ever hits the screen. Bill Lear has good possibilities for a movie. I also look at foreign potential. I won't write a book that has no potential for a foreign market, because that's basically, the foreign market is going to bring in some income to raise me to the level of making a living. My current book, Sobibor, is coming out in French, Dutch, hardbound British, hardbound French, possibly softbound French. I have Israeli, Japanese, and Italians looking at it. None of it is for a lot of money, but you put it all together, and it's the difference between going bankrupt and maybe making a little profit. So I measure every topic against these criteria. And the cost of writing it is another one. And wouldn't you believe, all the ones that I really want to do don't fit. So I end up with something down the line.
And my second question I wanted to ask was, how do you get the public to take notice into your work, Well, maybe that's not up to you to do when you write your work, but I'm a title person myself. When I go to bookstore, I check out the title first. I key in on the title. And, could you just give me some of just one or two techniques that are used in order to attract the public eye to your book or whatever you write?
Well, I have one story just like that. It's from Jackie.
Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh yeah, we
right,
forgot.
Okay, how do you get attraction, how do you attract attention to your book? Well, Jacqueline Suzanne was the best in the West on that one. And nothing was below her. I mean, she would do anything, and she did it well, right? But, well, the best place to have your book is next to the cash register, to be gross about it. And, you know, people checking out and they got change, or they're gonna, that's the place to be. And she used to, every time she produced a new book, go around the country and have champagne brunches for the truck drivers, the distributing truck drivers who carried the books in. And there's this big hustle where you put the book, right? You know, there's those turnaround racks that they would bury other ones and put hers up front, and then put a pile by the cash register. And I mean, the people that she romanced were the truck drivers, and she treated them splendidly, and the actual deliveries did a lot for her. I mean, that's one way. So there's little scams like that people learn about. I haven't, but I know other people do.
Well, more traditionally. The first thing you do is have, as you suggested, a title that people will find interesting. There are all these, you know, the three-word titles: the honorable schoolboy, the thingamajig factor. All of these things is a whole genre of titles that somehow they figure out attract people's attention, basically a noun and an adjective. And it suggests some mystery. That's great for selling novels. We really have, other than coming up with a title, we have almost nothing to do with the way the book attracts attention. It's totally out of our hands, as we've suggested. It's what they call marketing and promotion. We don't determine, for instance, what goes on the cover, with the cover design. We might get a chance to look at it and say we like it or we don't like it, but if we don't like it, that doesn't mean they're not going to use it. Where they market it, whether or not it gets into a supermarket, whether or not it gets onto these book racks, aside from your relationship with truck drivers, the way that really determines that is your publisher's relationship with the distributors, and whether your publisher winks when he presents your book on the list. I mean, every publisher has a list every 4 times a year or 3 times a year with 20 or 30 titles on it. If your title is not the one that is being pushed in that season, yours is the book that might not even get picked up by the distributor, or yours is the book that will be the one trailing along. Well, gee, take a few copies of this one too. So it's a real haphazard process. And it has a lot to do, unfortunately, with the mentality of salespeople rather than, I mean, we have enough trouble with critics, but salespeople who don't even look at our book in any sort of professional, critical way are the ones who really determine what happens to what the future of our book is. So it's,
Change your title too.
well, that wasn't in my contract. I mean, maybe some people have it like that. The movie people can. My book is being made, it's at least being handled by a studio. Whether or not they'll actually make a movie or not is still not totally determined, but I have no control over what the title will be, what the characterization will be, what the script will say. I have certain ways that I can express my opinion, none of which is binding on the studio.
I'd like to also respond to that. The single most important factor in getting your book known is the sales force for the publisher. The publisher has to decide how many books to publish. Publishers are ignorant. They don't know. They have no clue unless it's going to be, I mean, something really, really obvious, but then even then they can get their fingers burned. So they go to their salespeople who are in and out of these stores all the time, and supposedly the sales force knows. So the sales force basically tells the publisher how many to print. This is important. The advertising dollar follows the number of books printed. If you get a 5,000 print run or 7,500, they're not going to advertise it. You get 125,000, you better believe. See, they're treating your book as a winner by the number that they print. 125,000, it's got to be a winner. My God, if it's a winner, let's get behind it. So that's very important. If you're really wealthy, independently wealthy, you hire your own publicist, full-time, to publicize you and your book. There's a man in Washington, I apologize, I forgot his name. He wrote the book, How to Make Money. 5 book clubs and a lot. He is a stockbroker, Merrill Lynch. He says he makes $200,000 a year. Subtract 50,000, you're probably on target. Now, he made a decision that all the money that his book makes, he's plowing back into his book. He hired a publicist. She arranges, she even got him in some well-known newspapers. I mean, you're not supposed to, but she somehow got him in there, and she attacks cities for him and lines up promotion, television, radio, everything for him. This guy, Rabbi Kushner, who wrote the book, has been on the bestsellers list for some time now, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He's full-time promoting. He's hired a publicist full-time. But he's on the roll. In other words, if you're rolling them and you're hot, you go with it. And he's hot. So every dollar that he puts now into promoting is going to triple, probably. People like me can't afford it. So you have to rely on the publicist that your publisher assigns to you, provided they assign one. They generally handle, if you're lucky, you'll get one. Not always. Sometimes they just let you die. Generally, a publicist handles 10 books. 10 active books, new ones, not counting the old ones. So you can imagine how much time they can devote to you. So what you do is you just cooperate with that publicist as best you can, and they fight for book reviews, and do everything you can to cooperate, because it's about the only thing free you're getting from the publisher, so you go along with it. Other than stopping into bookstores to see if your book is there and autographing them so they can't send them back, there isn't much. there isn't much else you can do, except develop a strategy to protect yourself and to view yourself long term. I take everything I can get during a period of time. I'll go on all radio and talk shows, and I'll keep telling myself people will get to know me better for the next book, even if nothing happens on this one.
But the cheapest way is a good title, and it's funny how some of the famous titles in literary history in America have been so random and haphazard. Authors. There's a new book out called Rejection, and much of it's about great books that were rejected 15, 20, 35 times. And James Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice has nothing to do with it's not about postal delivery, right? His manuscript was returned 38 times in a period of a year and a half, and the last time he sent it out, the time he hit, he called it The Postman Always Rings Twice, changed the cover sheet and sent it out, and it sold. And and then Maddox Ford, the good soldier that was on TV a few weeks ago, his first line is, "This is the saddest story I ever heard," and he gave that as the title of his book. And his publisher said, "That's no good." He said, "This is wartime." So he said, "Okay," and he called it The Good Soldier instead, and it sold fairly well. So you just sort of go with the times and the trends and try to get a title that will be hot.
That's right. Just to take off on that, people don't necessarily read good books. They read what people tell them are good books. So you can have a piece of absolute schlock, and somebody will tell you that it's good, and you read it. And you can have a superb book which is not titled properly, and no one tells you that it's good, and you may not ever hear about it, or the title may not attract you, and you're just not going to read it.
A good example is Real Men Don't Eat Quiche. That is a total title. There's nothing in the book except the title. I mean, the book is a repetition of the same joke through the whole thing. And now there are 8 other books real extraterrestrials don't phone home and all. I mean, it's just the same.
Real women don't pump gas.
Yeah.
Real women don't pump, that's
My
number
next
2.
title, since I can't copyright it, I'll tell you, is Sex and the Single Grandmother.
You always write about yourself.
Right.
Not too personal, I'd like to ask a question about your contracts. Do you usually enter into a contract for a specific project, or is it to the extent that you're a staff employee of the publishing company?
How do you, sort of, the question, if I rephrase this, how do you get a contract? No, it's usually, in book publishing.
Or the extent, the standard, publishing agreement that you enter into, is it for like one specific book?
Oh, yes, usually it is a single book which you have submitted with a proposal and with fiction, you have to give them sample chapters and tell them how it's going to come out, the conclusion. And then they have an option clause, the publisher, which we are just beginning to attack now, that they get first look at your next book. They're always afraid your next one's going to be hot and hit, and they want a first crack at it, which sort of ties you up and curtails you in various ways. But it's usually a one-book contract. The biggies get two or three book contracts. Mailer's new book was a series of 5 that he had to do. So, but usually it's a one-book contract with an option on the next book.
Just the same
For nonfiction, yeah.
Yes.
The reason,
Excuse me.
we're probably going to do the same thing. The reason we don't like the option clause is that, in effect, it's unpaid servitude. There's no money given to you for the privilege that they have of deciding, of having first refusal on your next book. And as a result, when you go with your next project, as Richard described, it's a very arduous process to come up with a book proposal. It's not just having an idea, it's months of research often. You've done that, you can't, in some cases, you're bound to show them a manuscript, in other words, the whole book, and they still haven't agreed to take it. Whereas, most of us try, at the very least, to reduce that to an option on your next proposal, so that you don't have to finish the whole book before you show it to them. Because in effect, they're asking you to work free, and then give them a chance to decide whether or not they want it. It's totally unjust, but because we're at such a disadvantage, we haven't been able to get rid of it yet. We'd love an option clause if they would give us money up front. If they would say, okay, $25,000 advance for this book, plus your royalties, and a $5,000 option on your next book. Well, I'd look at that. That means that for a period of a year or 2 years, they give me $5,000 right now, and for 2 years, I will give them the right to look at my next work. In that case, you're talking about something that's fair, because the money is up front for the privilege of looking at the next thing that I work on.
I have an option clause. My contract should be coming in this week, and I'm going to remove it and see what happens. I mean, I'm just telling my agent, cut it. And but it's not quite true. You don't have to be famous to get a multi-book contract. Houghton Mifflin offered me a 2-book contract. There was a hook to it. The idea was they're not sure how well my current book is going to do. So they want to tie it in with the royalty of my next book, so that if the current book doesn't do well and the next one does well, then the money from the one that does well supports the one that hasn't. Double whammo. And I mean, I'm really not that dumb, you know. They really don't want me. They just want to cover themselves in case one does well and the other one doesn't. They can just, protect themselves. Contracts are standard. They have a standard form they send you. It's up to you to fight for everything in it. And obviously, everything is going to favor them. You have to fight. You don't have an agent. You don't even know what the war is about.
That was my next question too. All 3 of you have agents?
That's a big question too, if you want to talk
What's
about
the
it.
relationship between you and your agent generally? Is
both, love and hate.
Agents are often seen as bargainers, and that is only partially true. An agent's main job is to be a person who has good access to major publishers. That's a successful agent. If you have a good agent or a good agent firm, it means that your proposals will have a shot at the best slots in the best publishing houses. That's the major task. The fact that an agent will go into your contract language and try to get you a slightly better deal is really secondary to the primary purpose of an agent. In fact, when I negotiated my book contract, I did it with a lawyer, not with an agent. Because I already had the book placed, the question was the contract, and so I had a lawyer look at it and do the bargaining for me. And of course, our position is that we want to change the whole idea of a publisher's contract and make it a standard industry contract in which we have input as well as the publishers, so that it's not just this one-sided contract.
I have to make a comment on this agent stuff just for a second. I don't have an agent. I have 8 of them, if not more. I have an agent in Washington who is my primary agent, but she can't be everywhere, so she subcontracts. I have another agent in Great Britain handling my book there. I have one in Holland handling 2 of my books. I have one in France in Paris handling that one. I have one in Japan that's handling the rights of Killing of Karen Silkwood and trying to sell the new one. I have one I just signed up in Israel. Now, what happens? You sell it to a French publisher. The French agent takes 10%, sends a check to Washington. Your Washington agent takes 10% and sends it to you. The IRS takes the rest. What do you got, you know? But no, seriously, and I also have one in Hollywood because my agent is a book pusher. What does she know about television and the film industry? So she subcontracts to someone in Hollywood who is very good, and they divvy it up. You don't like to pay, but how am I going to do this and write books? How can I write books and sell stuff in France? I mean, it can't be done, so you pay. And sometimes you don't mind paying because it's really gravy coming in. Sometimes you really resent it, especially if you're not getting that much, and then people are grabbing. You don't mind if they work for it. You really hate them when they haven't done a thing. So you need them, and
So that's a separate contractual agreement?
yes. And then all these other agreements, but you don't make them. Your Washington agent makes a subcontracting agreement with everybody else, and she becomes the master coordinator, and answers all the correspondence, sends out books, and I have a Dutch contract waiting for me. I have to sign this afternoon. She negotiated that with the Dutch agent. And I don't have to fool around with checks. I mean, I get my checks, everything's taken off the top. I don't,
And now they're going up to 15% instead of the traditional 10 agents.
Right.
Big move abroad.
with new authors. So it
Right.
behooves me to hang on to my agent rather than look around for another one, because if I go to another one, there goes another, not 5%, 10%, because the foreign agent will go up 5% too, so I lose 30% on every foreign sale I have. If you're talking millions, who cares? But you're talking about that line between breaking even, going out to dinner once more, or maybe getting a new stereo, and then your agent is running off to Martha's Vineyard for the summer. You begin to say, hey, what's going on here? But
Yes.
Within the collective bargaining situation, as you all become much more organized, how do you see your relationship with the publishing world and the distributing world changing? And do you see any alternative way down the road as perhaps some alternative to having to deal with these people you hate so much, and author-owned to collective publishing, distributing, whatever? I
All right, well, I'll repeat the question as requested, and then I think I'll turn it over to John, who's our collective bargaining expert. How will collective bargaining, once the nation's writers become organized in our union, affect relationships within the publishing industry? Mr. Dingus.
Well, I want to stress that it's the use of the word hate is quite a bit overblown. Editors, as people, are usually former writers, and in their they're just as nice and nasty as writers are. It's just that somehow when you get into a relationship in which you have all the power, the possibility of engendering resentment goes up to the infinite degree. And that's why there's so much resentment. It's not personal at all. As somebody said, some of my best friends are editors. But what collective bargaining would we're seeing it along two tracks. One is the one you suggested, but the first track is to gain some clout in the industry through the typical collective action of a lot of writers who write for one publisher getting together and demanding the same thing at the same time. That's the basics. How you actually do that requires a lot of originality. It's never been done before, and it's a little bit complicated, and we don't know whether we've exactly chosen the right model to do it, but we're experimenting and we're going along with this. There is also another track that we're working on somewhat more slowly, and that's some ideas for utilizing the new technology for self-publishing. Because it's becoming evident that the editor's role is more that of an acquisition agent than a person who works with pen and pencil and who actually does the Maxwell Perkins job of shaping your manuscript into a better manuscript. An acquisition agent can be my buddy in the union. I don't need the publisher. The second function of a publisher, the publishing complex, is as a bank. You need somebody to front the money to cost it out, to pay for the production, to carry the project into the bookstores. That's a sum of money. If you look at the publisher as a bank, you can see it as something that is also replaceable. The third thing that a publisher is a name. They're famous names. They're considered, there are quality houses, less quality houses, academic houses, pulp fiction houses, romantic houses. That's more of a problem than anything else. In self-publishing, what you would do, conceivably, is take, this is really theoretical, and I'm not saying that these are projects that are going to go into effect next year, but just to give you the idea that these things are being thought of in the writers' movement, that you will put together, a writer will put together his project, go to the organization that is doing this, put together a package and bid it out. You bid out the printing, you bid out the financing. You may get it from a bank if you can set this up right so that in effect you're providing the security. You bid out the printing. Now a lot of printing is done overseas. In other words, our publishers don't even have presses anymore. They bid out the printing. In other words, you put together a publishing distribution package and a promotion package with firms that do this, and you basically do it in an atmosphere in which you control, you keep your hands on the reins. And that's conceivable. And it is especially conceivable because in this case, the technology that is being developed, the benefits of it accrue entirely to the author. In other words, you're saying to you hire an editor, as Richard has done, to put your manuscript into good shape. You go with the discs to a printer, which is the next step along the line, and you give them the discs, and all you're paying for is the transference of those disc modules into the printed page. Exactly what the publisher did, with the difference that you're paying the cost, the real cost, and not the way the publisher does it. So there are real possibilities being opened up by the way the business is developing. Maybe something along these lines will be done. A friend of mine in Denver, Colorado, I went out there to give some talks on Central America and at the universities. And I met an old friend I hadn't seen for 10 years. He was a struggling short story writer, so struggling that I don't think he's ever had anything published when I knew him. And I met him again in Denver, and he was writing a cookbook. and no, it wasn't a cookbook, it was a restaurant book. On the line of, the famous book, The Underground Gourmet or something like that, for Denver, Colorado. He was doing it entirely himself. And he already had the book in hand. He had contracted it out. He'd gotten somebody to do the design. It was very well designed with a good cartoonist, real nice internal design, a nice cover. And he'd gone through the printing process, all of which had cost him, I think, a total of $1,500, something like that. And he was now in the process of distributing, which he did by putting the books in the backpack and going around to the bookstores. So some people are doing it, and I think they're more likely to be doing it out in the rest of the country than in the power centers of this country, because here we're kind of limited by our imagination is limited by our environment. They know they can't get published in New York, and they say, the heck with New York, I'll do it myself. And amazingly, it's working. 10th Street Press is another example of a very small press that just did it themselves. And they've made, that's the success story in that kind of operation. So it's possible. Yeah.
From what I've heard earlier, I can see that you're not all real pleased with the present work for hire provision in the current copyright law. What other provisions would you care to see changed, and are there any new provisions that you would like to see in the future or whenever inserted?
In the copyright law? The question was, what changes would we like as writers in the copyright law? I don't know the copyright. I've only studied the work for hire provision. The only change I would like in that, I think the problem could be solved if we would simply stipulate in the copyright law that work for hire if we define work for hire. No, not differently. It's okay. The problem is that you can stipulate a fiction the way the law is written now. You can say that black is white simply by signing it. If the publisher comes to you and says, you say that this is work for hire. In other words, you say that this is a book done collectively with no determined author and all of those things. Then you sign it, and that book becomes a collective work for hire. Whereas if you define that work for hire will apply only to works that meet the following qualifications, namely not done by a particular author, and you would have to define that fairly closely. You would have to define what you mean by works done in a collective venture. Then it'd be okay, because it would limit the purpose of the law to those particular cases where it makes sense. And it would not allow us to be forced into the position of signing away rights that are ours. I think it would be a fairly simple change, and I think there was one of those cases where a law was really, I don't know the history of it, but I think that it was not meant to be misused the way it was meant.
Well, during the...
Excuse me, I have to put in a new tape. If you just want to hold on a second.
As employees of the publisher, and how it seems to tie in to a reestablishment or reaffirmation of a certain part of the shopyright doctrine, that you would have more control over your work product, and that it wouldn't categorically, whether it be based upon your raw employment relationship or based upon a particular topic, that you would be writing about automatically be considered work for hire.
Yeah. Are you ready?
We're ready, yes.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to go on that? Yeah.
This is again another question on work for hire. I would like to see it defined totally as status of an employee, that if you work for an organization and this work is produced at that time, then it would clearly belong to them. But if you are not employed, not covered by any of the perks that go with complete employment, I don't think then you should be considered an employee, and that your rights should revert to the company since you're not but that's, I don't know if that's...
All right, so you want to balance that on the one side and balance the antitrust exemption.
Well,
And then, as you mentioned earlier, as far as not being considered an independent contractor or freelancer for antitrust, and for any antitrust provisions, but an employee.
Right, if we're not employees, and receive none of those benefits, we should not be, our rights should not be taken from us. If they want to consider us employees, and Simon & Schuster, my publisher, wants to cover me for 3 years while I'm writing, give me health benefits, vacation pay, blah, 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 then I'm willing to consider exchanging my copyrights, my copyright protection, in exchange for some of the benefits that would accrue to me as an employee. So we got it on both ends. We lose copyright protection, and we don't get any of the perks that would go with full employment.
I see a flaw with a situation where a commission work can be considered a work made for hire just because you sign you endorse your check and they've stamped it saying that this work would be considered a work made for hire. There are legal problems with that. Well, this is what was discussed in the Practicing Law Institute as early as mid-1978. The issues being that, first of all, can you really commission a work after the fact? That's one problem. The other problem is the contract that you sign under duress
Binding.
can it be binding? I just wanted to throw that out.
Right, well, again, well, do you want to?
Say something about that. I'd like to respond a little bit to the, well, the question concerns work for hire again, and the possibility that precedents will be set ruling out its application in the cases that I've described, namely being forced to describe your work as work for hire. As far as I know, this hasn't filtered into the practice in the industry. And the organization that is doing the most on our side to lobby on this issue, which is the Graphic Artists Guild, they do it because, I mean, they do designs and pictures, but basically as far as copyright is concerned, they're under the same problems that we have. Except that they do more work for hire because drawing lends itself more to these kinds of collective works. But it doesn't seem, I don't think that there have been any cases that I know of that have really narrowed that provision so that it would be impossible to do it. And as far as signing under duress, legally, any contract that you sign for an economic reason is not considered to be under duress. I mean, you're doing it in exchange for compensation, so it can't be considered to be duress. In other words, I give you the money, you sign the contract. I mean, that's the way we do business in this country. Rights, we try to negotiate rights over and above those things so that there are certain things not subject to this economic duress. But I don't think we can get by just on the basis of duress. And so I think that we have to, that we're going to have to change the wording of the law. I wanted to say something about your comments on the employee status. I don't quite agree with Barbara, even though we're in the same organization on this concepts of this. I would like to have it both ways. We now have, the publishers now have it both ways. I think we'll go for the whole thing and try to turn it around completely. I see no reason why we shouldn't be given the benefits of copyright as well as the benefits of employee status. There's nothing in the copyright law, there's nothing in the copyright concept, to me, that excludes the idea of your relationship with a publisher being one of an employee to an employer. If I do something for my employer, and I negotiate with him so that I retain rights over the product after it's gone off the assembly line, we're certainly not talking about Ford cars, but we're talking about a piece of writing which has a very long history as a product. And traditionally, since the very beginning, the idea that an author has rights over the final product and that continues to be in his name or her name. I don't think that we should be assumed to have lost that by introducing the idea of employer-employee relationship into the publisher, because the publisher relationship is, in many ways, employer-employee relationship. And we work under contract. We have obligations. We invest no capital of our own. At least we try not to. I mean, sometimes we're forced to in a sense, but in the same sense that a plumber has to buy his tools. We have to put a certain amount of money into it. So to me, I don't think it's incompatible, and I would fight for keeping the employer-employee relation, or establishing the employer-employer relationship and not sacrificing our copyright. The screenwriters who are unionized cede their copyright to whoever they sell their piece to. And they've decided to do that, and they've talked to us about what that means, and they've, to a certain extent, presented it as a disjunctive. Either you get the copyright or you get the employee status. But I still think that we can do it the other way. Because, first of all, what we're producing is not determined. Screenwriters write something that in many ways, the most common screenwriting situation is not the kind of situation we're talking about in writing a book. A screenwriter basically is given an idea from the outside. So do a pilot on, let's see, we're going to do a TV show in a condominium, and we have this family here, we have a singles couple here, and we have a gay couple here, and let's, jumble those situations up and give me a pilot program. That's a typical screenwriter's assignment. Or, write 3 segments in this TV series on condominiums. So it's not, it's different in many ways, and so I think, and so obviously the copyright loses its meaning in a situation where you're basically filling in the blanks in a situation that's preconceived. So we're over our time. Should we stop here and let you all go have lunch? Thank you for listening.